The world's most recognizable rock star managed to vanish for 48 hours without anyone noticing. What Freddie Mercury discovered during those missing days would haunt him forever, changing the way he approached his music, his relationships, and his own mortality. This is the untold story of October 1983, when rock music's most flamboyant performer disappeared into the shadows and emerged as a completely different person. October 17, 1983. Garden Lodge, Kensington, London. Freddie Mercury's personal assistant Peter Freestone arrived for his usual morning duties to find something that sent chills down his spine. An empty house, an unlocked door, and no note explaining where his boss had gone. For a man as meticulous and routine-oriented as Freddie, this was completely unprecedented. What followed was 48 hours of confusion, fear, and frantic searching that would remain one of rock music's greatest mysteries. But more importantly, what Freddie experienced during those missing days would fundamentally alter his perspective on life, success, and what really mattered. This is the story of where he went, what he discovered, and why he chose to keep it secret for so long. The perfect storm. The autumn of 1983 was a turbulent time for Freddie Mercury. Queen had just completed their Hot Space tour, an album cycle that had been commercially successful but artistically divisive. Critics had accused the band of abandoning their rock roots for dance music, and internal tensions were running high. Freddie was at a crossroads, questioning his artistic direction and struggling with the relentless pressure of fame. But there was something deeper troubling him, something his closest friends had noticed but couldn't quite identify. Freddie had become increasingly introspective, often staring out windows lost in thought, asking philosophical questions about legacy and meaning. His longtime friend Mary Austin later recalled that Freddie seemed haunted by something he couldn't articulate. The week before his disappearance, Freddie had been unusually withdrawn. He'd canceled several social engagements, spent hours alone in his music room without actually playing anything, and had begun giving away personal possessions to friends, a behavior that alarmed everyone who knew him. It was like he was preparing for something, Peter Freestone remembered, but none of us understood what. On the evening of October 16th, Freddie hosted a small dinner party at Garden Lodge. Guests later described him as being present but not really there, going through the motions of being a gracious host while clearly preoccupied with something else. The party ended earlier than usual, with Freddie claiming fatigue and ushering everyone out by 10 p.m. But what happened after everyone left would set the stage for his mysterious disappearance, and you won't believe what triggered his decision to vanish. The vanishing. The next morning, Peter Freestone arrived at Garden Lodge at his usual time of 9 a.m. to find the front door unlocked, strange for someone as security-conscious as Freddie. Calling out and receiving no response, Peter began searching the house. Freddie's bed had been slept in, but he was nowhere to be found. His passport was still in its usual place, his wallet was on the dresser, and his car keys were hanging by the door. Most alarmingly, Freddie's beloved cats, usually the first to greet anyone entering the house, seemed agitated and confused, suggesting their owner had left unexpectedly without making provisions for them. This was completely out of character for a man who treated his cats like children and never went anywhere without ensuring they were properly cared for. Peter immediately began making phone calls. He contacted Mary Austin, who hadn't heard from Freddie since the previous evening. He called Queen's manager Jim Beach, who was equally mystified. He reached out to Freddie's closest friends in London's social circuit. Nobody had seen or heard from him. It was as if rock music's most recognizable star had simply evaporated into thin air. By noon, panic was beginning to set in. The decision was made to keep the disappearance quiet. The last thing anyone wanted was media attention that might compromise Freddie's safety or privacy. But privately, his inner circle was terrified. In 1983, AIDS was beginning to ravage London's gay community, and everyone close to Freddie knew he was potentially at risk. The fear that something terrible had happened to him was overwhelming. Brian May was contacted at his home and immediately drove to London. The moment Peter called and told me Freddie was missing, my blood ran cold. May recalled years later. Freddie never just disappeared. He was too responsible, too considerate of the people who worked for him. Something had to be seriously wrong. But what they discovered in Freddie's music room would provide the first clue about where he might have gone, and it would change everything they thought they knew about his state of mind. The clues. While searching Garden Lodge for any indication of Freddie's whereabouts, Peter Freestone made a discovery that would prove crucial to understanding what had happened. On the piano in Freddie's music room sat a handwritten note, not an explanation of where he was going, but something far more cryptic and disturbing. The note, which has never been publicly shared in its entirety, contained lyrics to an unfinished song. The words spoke of feeling trapped, of needing to find the real me beneath the costume, and of a journey that needed to be taken alone. At the bottom of the page, Freddie had written a single line that sent chills through everyone who read it. Sometimes you have to lose yourself to find out who you really are. Next to the note was a photograph that provided another clue. It was an old picture of Zanzibar, the island where Freddie had been born as Farrokh Bulsara before his family fled to England. The photo showed Stone Town, the historic center of Zanzibar City, with its narrow alleyways and ancient architecture. But Freddie's passport was still at Garden Lodge, so he couldn't have flown anywhere. Where had he gone? Roger Taylor, who had joined the search by this point, noticed something else that seemed significant. Several books had been pulled from Freddie's extensive library and left open on his desk. They included works by philosophers, spiritual texts, and books about identity and transformation. It looked like he'd been studying, preparing for something, Taylor observed. But preparing for what? The search. As the first day of Freddie's disappearance turned into evening with no word from the missing rock star, his friends began to fear the worst. Jim Beach seriously considered calling the police, but Mary Austin convinced him to wait another day. Freddie values his privacy above everything, she argued. If he's doing this deliberately, calling the police would be the ultimate betrayal of his trust. The decision to wait was agonizing but ultimately correct. Throughout that first night, various members of Freddie's inner circle took turns staying at Garden Lodge, hoping he might return or at least call to explain what was happening. The house felt eerily empty without its flamboyant owner, and his cats roamed from room to room looking for him, their plaintive meows adding to the atmosphere of worry and confusion. Brian May spent the night sitting at Freddie's piano, reading and rereading the cryptic note, trying to decipher what had driven his friend to vanish so suddenly. The words spoke of someone searching for authenticity, for truth beneath the performance, May later wrote in his diary. It made me realize how little we really knew about what was going on inside Freddie's head. The second day brought no new information. Freddie remained missing, unreachable, seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. His friends expanded their search, discreetly checking hospitals, contacting mutual acquaintances, even driving around London's neighborhoods where Freddie was known to frequent. Nothing. It was as if the most famous face in rock music had managed to become completely invisible. And here's what nobody realized. That was exactly what Freddie wanted. The truth revealed. On the evening of October 19th, exactly 48 hours after he'd vanished, Freddie Mercury reappeared as mysteriously as he'd disappeared. Peter Freestone was at Garden Lodge feeding the cats when he heard a key in the front door. There stood Freddie, looking exhausted, but somehow more at peace than Peter had seen him in months. "Hello, darling," Freddie said casually, as if he'd just been out for groceries. "Have I missed anything important?" The relief that flooded through Peter was immediately replaced by confusion and, admittedly, some anger. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "Everyone's been worried sick about you." Freddie's response was characteristically enigmatic. "I've been finding myself, and I'd rather not discuss the details, if you don't mind." Over the following days, as word spread that Freddie had safely returned, his friends pressed him for answers about where he'd been and what had happened. He remained frustratingly vague, offering only cryptic hints about needing to remember who I was before I became who I am, and walking through my past to understand my future. But some details did eventually emerge, pieced together from Freddie's rare comments and observations made by those closest to him. What became clear was that Freddie's disappearance wasn't an impulsive act, but a carefully planned spiritual journey that had taken him to unexpected places and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his life. And what he discovered during those 48 hours would influence everything he created for the rest of his career, but the full truth would remain hidden for decades. The journey reconstructed. Years after Freddie's death, when those closest to him felt comfortable sharing more details, a picture began to emerge of where he'd actually been during those missing 48 hours. The The story that unfolded was both surprising and profoundly moving, revealing a side of Freddie Mercury that few people ever witnessed. According to Mary Austin, who Freddie eventually confided in years later, he had spent those 2 days traveling incognito through the poorest neighborhoods of London, wearing simple, nondescript clothing and avoiding areas where he might be recognized. Freddie had deliberately immersed himself in the lives of ordinary people struggling with ordinary problems. He'd apparently spent time in homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and community centers in East London, observing and occasionally conversing with people who had no idea they were talking to one of the world's biggest rock stars. He'd slept on park benches, eaten in cheap cafes, and experienced London from a perspective completely different from the luxury and privilege he'd become accustomed to. But more importantly, Freddie had spent hours in Southall, a neighborhood with a large South Asian community, walking the streets and visiting the temples and cultural centers that reminded him of his family's heritage. For a man who had spent his entire career as Freddie Mercury, these hours reconnecting with his identity as Farrokh Bulsara were profoundly significant. He told me he needed to strip away all the artifice and remember what it felt like to be nobody special, Mary Austin revealed in a 2010 interview. He said those 2 days taught him more about himself than 20 years of fame had done. But the most significant encounter during his disappearance would prove that Freddie's journey was about more than just self-discovery. And what happened next shows the profound impact those 48 hours had on him. The encounter that changed everything. The most significant moment of Freddie's 48-hour journey came on the second day, when he encountered a young man dying of AIDS in a charity clinic in East London. The details of this encounter were shared by Freddie only with his closest confidant Mary Austin, and she chose to reveal them only after many years had passed. The young man, whose name has never been made public out of respect for his family, was approximately Freddie's age and had been a musician before his diagnosis. He had no family visiting him, no friends to sit by his bedside, and was facing death alone and in pain. Freddie, still maintaining his anonymity, sat with this stranger for several hours, simply offering companionship to someone who desperately needed it. During their conversation, the dying man spoke about his regrets, not about his lifestyle or his choices, but about time wasted on things that didn't matter. He talked about relationships he'd neglected in pursuit of success, about music he'd never written because he was too concerned with commercial viability, about love he'd been too afraid to accept because of what others might think. He told me he wished he'd lived more authentically, Freddie later confided to Mary. He said the worst part of dying wasn't the physical pain. It was realizing how much time he'd wasted trying to be what other people expected instead of being himself. This conversation had a profound impact on Freddie, forcing him to confront his own life choices and the persona he'd created. Here was someone facing death without the cushion of fame or wealth, stripped down to pure human essence, and their regrets were remarkably similar to the fears Freddie had been wrestling with. It was a mirror held up to his own existence, and what he saw both terrified and liberated him. When Freddie left the clinic that evening, he knew he was changed. The young man died later that night, never knowing he'd spent his final hours with Freddie Mercury. But that encounter would influence everything Freddie did for the rest of his life. The transformation. The Freddie Mercury who returned to Garden Lodge after 48 hours was noticeably different from the one who had left. Those closest to him observed changes that were subtle but significant. He was more present in conversations, less concerned with maintaining his theatrical public persona in private settings, and more willing to express vulnerability with his friends. Most importantly, Freddie's approach to music shifted dramatically. The albums Queen created after his disappearance, particularly The Works, A Kind of Magic, and later Innuendo, showed a new depth and authenticity in Freddie's songwriting. Songs like It's a Hard Life and 1 Year of Love carried emotional weight that felt more genuine, more personal than much of his earlier work. After he came back from wherever he'd been, Freddie started writing about real emotions instead of just clever lyrics, Brian May observed. There was a rawness to his vocals that hadn't been there before. He was singing from a deeper place. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Freddie related to his success and fame. He became more philanthropic, though he kept most of his charitable work private. He started spending more time with old friends from his pre-fame days, reconnecting with people who had known Farrokh Bulsara rather than Freddie Mercury. And he began speaking more openly, at least in private, about the disconnect between his public image and his authentic self. The lasting mystery. To this day, certain aspects of Freddie's 48-hour disappearance remain mysterious. Despite the details that eventually emerged, there are gaps in the timeline that have never been fully explained. Where exactly did he sleep during those 2 nights? Who else did he encounter during his journey? What other moments of revelation occurred that he never shared with anyone? Some of Freddie's friends believe there were additional experiences during those 48 hours that he took to his grave. Peter Freestone noted that Freddie would sometimes get a distant look in his eyes and say things like, "You'd be surprised what you learn when no one knows who you are." Or, "Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones where you travel alone." The cryptic note Freddie left on his piano was never finished into a complete song, though musical phrases from it appeared in several later Queen tracks. Brian May believes that the unfinished lyrics represented Freddie's attempt to express something that ultimately couldn't be captured in words alone, a transformative experience that transcended language. Roger Taylor has suggested that Freddie's disappearance was a spiritual crisis that needed to be resolved through action rather than contemplation. John Deacon, typically the most reserved about Freddie's private life, simply said, "Fred needed to remember who he was. The rest is his business, not ours." The legacy of disappearance. Freddie's mysterious 48 hours in October 1983 became a turning point in his personal and artistic journey. The experience clearly influenced his creative output, his relationships, and his approach to fame for the remainder of his life. More importantly, it demonstrated that even the most successful people sometimes need to step away from everything they've built to rediscover their core identity. The encounter with the dying musician in the East London clinic proved particularly prophetic. When Freddie himself was diagnosed with AIDS a few years later, he approached his final years with the wisdom he'd gained during those missing days, focusing on creating authentic art, cherishing genuine relationships, and living without regret. Friends who were with Freddie during his final illness noted that he often referenced lessons learned during my walkabout, as he sometimes called his disappearance. He encouraged others to strip away the bullshit and figure out what really matters before it's too late. His determination to keep recording music until his final days reflected the dying musician's regret about unwritten songs. The most profound legacy of Freddie's disappearance might be the reminder that authenticity requires courage, that finding yourself sometimes means losing yourself first, and that even rock gods need moments of pure, anonymous humanity to remember what it means to be simply human. The truth we'll never know. Complete details of what Freddie experienced during those 48 hours will likely remain forever mysterious. Those who knew pieces of the story have taken those secrets to their own graves, respecting Freddie's wish for privacy about his most personal journey. What we do know is that something profound occurred during those missing days that changed the trajectory of his remaining years. Perhaps the mystery itself is appropriate for a man who built his career on theatrical artifice, while simultaneously searching for authentic self-expression. Freddie Mercury spent his life performing, but during those 48 hours in October 1983, he stopped performing and started simply being. And that experience of raw, unfiltered humanity proved more transformative than any stage show or recording session ever could. Today, when people discuss Freddie Mercury's greatest performances, they typically point to Live Aid, Wembley Stadium, or the many legendary concerts Queen delivered. But those who knew him best understand that his most important performance was the one where he stopped performing altogether. Those 48 mysterious hours when Freddie Mercury disappeared and Farrokh Bulsara remembered who he'd always been underneath the costume. That's the mysterious story of Freddie Mercury's unexplained disappearance and the profound journey that changed him forever. If this untold story intrigued you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Mercury Moments family for more hidden chapters from Queen's legendary frontman's life. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe in the importance of finding yourself, and let us know in the comments what you think really happened during those missing 48 hours. Until next time, remember, sometimes you have to lose yourself to find who you really are.